On behalf of Namita Gokhale, William Dalrymple, and all my colleagues at Teamwork Arts, welcome back to JLF's Brave New World, Season 2. Our magazine partner for the series is The Week, Journalism with a Human Touch. Our first session of the day is Virtuoso, Vir Sanghvi, in conversation with Pragya Tiwari. India's leading food writer, editor, and celebrated television anchor, Vir Sanghvi takes us on a fascinating journey through his life and times, with his sharp-eyed observations on changing society and challenges of a new political landscape. In conversation with journalist Pragya Tiwari, he talks about media and culture, food and memory, and the dynamics of a new India in the throes of transformation. Vir Sanghvi is a columnist and TV presenter. He was formerly editor of the Hindustan Times. He's anchored shows on CNN, News 18, NDTV, Discovery, and other networks. His published books include the best-selling Men of Steel and Mandate. His most recent books are The Game Changers and The Indian Pantry. Pragya Tiwari is a journalist who's written extensively on politics, identity, policy, and culture, and has edited publications such as Tehalka, The Big Indian Picture, and Vice. All our sessions that have been broadcast till now are available on our Facebook page, JLF Litfest, and of course on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Litfest JLF. Please do remember to ask questions and comment by typing it into the comment section below. And Pragya will be happy to pose these off Veer at the end of the conversation. And in case any of you drop off due to bandwidth issues, you can find us on our Facebook page and our YouTube channels. And of course, if we drop off, just hang in there and we promise to be right back. Ladies and gentlemen, Virtuoso, Vir Sanghvi in conversation with Pragya Tiwari. Pragya, over to you.
Thank you, Sanjoy. Welcome, all of you. A very good evening. And hello, Veer. The idea of going down memory lane with you is absolutely thrilling. It's very exciting to me, but it's also very, very daunting because I have 35 minutes to talk to you about not only a lifetime, but everything that it encompasses, which is media, which is journalism, which is politics, which is food. So I'm going to get right to it. And I'm going to start at the beginning. In a very
before you start, can I just say thank you for doing this? I'm thrilled to be here. We've never actually met, but I'm a big fan, and it's really a thrill to be doing this with you.
That's very kind of you. I am the biggest fan, so I'm really glad that JLF got us together. But I am absolutely, so the world of Bombay in the 70s is something that, I didn't see as an adult, but it's where I live in my head. And I imagine it to be a place full of all kinds of wonders. You were young, very, very young. You were working with the Bombay magazine. And a little bird tells me you were also moonlighting on the side for Super, and you were writing about cinema as well. And of course, then you went on to work for many other magazines while you were in Bombay. But tell us about that world. What was it like? What was the world of magazines, weekly magazines like? What was Bombay like in the 70s? What was it like to be there, young and a fresh journalist?
Well, Pragya, actually, there wasn't a magazine scene. I went to school in England, and I finished in 1975 December. And there was, in those days, a custom in England that if you're going to university, you took several months off. So I was in Bombay from the December in India, from the December of 75 to the October of 76. That was roughly the same time as India Today's launch. This was the emergency. So it wasn't a great time for journalism. India Today tried very hard to get people to write for it. And they were an unknown Delhi printing press that had started a magazine. So Bombay journalists, who then regarded the Times of India as the hallowed center of all journalism, treated India Today with contempt. So I think more out of desperation than anything else, they turned to me, a school leaver and complete faltu who had nothing else to do. And they said, will you do stories for us? And it was fun for me not because of money. They paid me. I remember you did a thing for the People page, you got paid 50 rupees. You did a full-fledged article, you got paid 150 rupees, which was not a lot of money even in those days. But it was the opportunity to go off and do interesting things. And one thing I learned quite quickly when I became a journalist is that journalism, even if it's for a magazine that no one has heard of, which is what India Today was in those days, gives you access. People like seeing their names in print. They like being written about. So I had a ball. I just went all around Bombay, doing things, interviewing anybody who was willing to talk to me, writing everything, but of course non-political because we were in the emergency during this period. And then when I went up to university, I discovered that I had just 3 8-week terms, which meant 6 months of each year I was free to come back to Bombay, which is what I did. I continued writing for India Today, and then eventually, of course, that led to Bombay Magazine. What was the India of the 70s like? Oh, a very different place, much more parochial, much less money obsessed, much more, well, less international, much more focused within itself. Remember in the 70s, if somebody released a record abroad, it wouldn't get to India for 6 months or 7 months. If you wanted to get a pair of jeans, say even Levi's, forget about designer jeans, you had to hope that an uncle or an aunt brought it for you. There weren't very many great standalone restaurants. There were only two hotels of consequence in Bombay. It was a very, very different world.
And of course, the film industry, which you, I mean, I know you were just writing a couple of articles for Super, but you would have got a glimpse of what the film industry was like in the 70s. I would love to hear what your first impression of the film industry was. I mean, again, for those of you who don't know, I believe you were reading PPE in Oxford
Yes.
as your subject. So obviously, this is a very different world, and now you're in the world of journalism, and you're straddling both these worlds. What were your first impressions like of the film industry in the 70s?
I actually did a lot of film journalism because during the emergency, there wasn't much else to write about from Bombay. And this was a period when Stardust ruled, Stardust, Super, and later Movie, where a lot of the staff of Super shifted, and which I also wrote for. And the big challenge before us was, could you write about films and not write about it in a Stardust kind of way? And I said to Arun Puri, who started it, who was editor of India Today at that stage, and was resistant, I think, to the idea of doing any film stories at all. I used an argument that I was sure would work, which is, Arun, Time magazine does it here. Why can't we do it? And of course, in those days, India Today was the Indian Time magazine. So he said, really? So I showed him various stories that Time had done on cinema. And he said, okay, do it. So one story I remember in particular was, this must have been, I'm trying to remember when, 77, 78. Raj Kapoor made, post-emergency, Raj Kapoor made a film called Satyam Shivam Sundaram, which was like a big, big deal. Not because of the quality of the film, which frankly was abysmal when I saw it later, but because they released many pictures of or they leaked many pictures of Zinat Aman wearing skimpy clothes. So everybody wanted to find out about the film, and they wouldn't, of course, allow anybody onto the sets, allow anyone to see it. And so I said to Arun, I said, because Arun's father was in film finance and they knew Raj Kapoor from the old days. I said, if you can pull this off, if you can get us a meeting with Raj Kapoor, here's a Time magazine story called Kubrick's Greatest Gamble about Stanley Lyndon. Stanley, I think his film is called Stanley Lyndon. Barry Lyndon film is called. Barry Lyndon. I will do a similar story. And he said, we'll call it Raj Kapoor's Greatest Gamble. So I said, sure. And we did that story on Satyam Shivam Sundaram. I remember I went to Bangalore to meet Zinat Aman, who was then shooting for what was probably the worst film ever made, a film called Shalimar, which you probably don't remember. An English, you remember it, saw it?
I love it. Sorry.
All right, okay. Well, not enough of you out there because it sank without a trace. And then we got Raj Kapoor. And Raj Kapoor, for a man who'd been very reluctant to talk about the film, really took to the idea. And he used to have a little shack, or looked like a garage, which was romanticized in the film magazines as his cottage at RK Studios. And I wandered in, and there was this gaddi on the floor, and there was Raj Kapoor, who in those days was already, let's put it nicely, large and very fair, had very sort of light eyes, wore a white kurta, had endless cups of tea while he spoke. And he was like an anecdote machine. I just sat there and he talked and he talked and he talked late into the night. The trick was, I thought, not to take a single note. So I committed it all to memory, and I got every last anecdote out of him, not just about this film, but about Nargis, about his contacts with the Russians, how Nargis was much better and more sophisticated than Zinat Aman, which was, I thought, an interesting one. How the film industry of the 60s and the 50s, which he loved, was so much better. how he couldn't bear to see an Amitabh Bachchan film, how everything had the same, every film had the same story of one policeman fighting smugglers, and he would see the film in the screening theater and he would know immediately what the plot was, even before the film had started. And he said, we didn't call it Bollywood in those days. He said, Bombay cinema has lost its heart. I will give it its heart back. And then he made this really bad film with a heroine in very skimpy clothes. So at least the intention was noble, even if the film wasn't.
What I wouldn't do to read that article or read all of your notes from that meeting. But
I'm doing a book actually. So all these, which will be released sometime next year, which is written on the sort of slightly deluded assumption that anyone would care about my life, but it's a memoir. It should be out next spring or summer. So many of these anecdotes will be there.
well, I for one will be one of the first people to buy a copy for what that's worth. But so you move at some point. We're obviously fast forwarding through a lot of things here, but at some point you move from Bombay to Delhi. Is that
Much
correct?
later, much later. I
Much
go.
later? So when
I
you
finish with. I'll tell you the brief chronology. I become editor of Bombay magazine in '78. The first issue comes out in '79 after I've just come down from university. I stay with them till '81. I go abroad on a scholarship. I come back in '82. In '83, I become editor of a feature magazine called Imprint in Bombay. In '86, I shift to Calcutta as editor of Sunday, which was there a big magazine of that era. And I don't actually come to Delhi even part-time till '93. So essentially, my life was really Bombay and Calcutta till the '90s.
So very quickly, I have to ask you about Calcutta. Sunday belonged to the ABP group, of
Yes.
course, and I grew up in Calcutta. And I remember Sunday so vividly. I remember as a kid, I remember some covers of Sunday so vividly. Very quickly, what was Calcutta like? I mean, going from Bombay to Calcutta, I imagine there were very different cities in the 70s. I mean, they're still very different cities, but
That's a good question because I joined Anand Bazaar in 1986 and I did it purely on impulse. I knew I had to leave Imprint, and Samir Jain, who had then just taken over the Times of India and was installing all his men in key positions, who I knew quite well, offered me a job as editor of what was then called the Sunday Review, which was quite a large magazine section, not unlike Branch, but in broadsheet format, that went out with the Sunday Times of India all over India. And I accepted the job. And then I don't know what happened. At the last moment, I had misgivings. I'd never met Avik Sarkar, but I had heard good things about Anand Bazaar Patrika. So I called him and said, can I come and see you? And he said, sure. And he was coming to Bombay the following week. I came and went and saw him. And I said, I want a job, which was, I thought, an unusual thing to have done because I had Samir's letter of appointment in my pocket. But something just told me this was right. And he said, yes. And he said, come to Calcutta and we will discuss the job. So I think the following week, I went to Calcutta. And you're asking what Calcutta was like. I stayed at the Grand Hotel. You're probably too young to remember this. But in those days, the Grand Hotel had no entrance. It was just a row of shops in Chaurangi, and there was a door, a sort of almost unmarked door, and you walked through that door and you went to this old, fabulous five-star hotel. So I stayed at the Grand, and I told Avik, where shall we meet? And he said, come to my office. So I said, sure. And can you give me the address? And he said, are you mad? This is Anand Bazaar. You're in Calcutta. Every passing stranger will tell you. So I said, okay. So I went down and I asked for a taxi. The doorman got me a taxi. The guy had never heard of Anand Bazaar, which I was not surprised by. And the doorman, who seemed slightly more intelligent, said, no, I will explain it to you. Big newspaper. And explained it to him. So I got into the car. It wasn't very far. And we drove up before this wonderful building, which really looked nice. It was clearly a newspaper office. Really impressive, colonial. And I got out and I said to the guy who was at the reception, can I see Avik Sarkar? And he said, who? So I said, Avik Sarkar. And he said, I think you're at the wrong place. So I said, isn't this Anand Bazaar Patrika? So he said, no, this is the Statesman. So I then walked out and walked to Anand Bazaar Patrika, which I had been assured by Avik every passing stranger knew. A few minutes to this grubby little lane called Prafulla Sarkar Street and into this old-fashioned office where all the peons still wore dhotis. And not only did the peons, so did Avik Sarkar. So he greeted me in his office wearing his kurta, carefully crumpled at the sleeves with diamond buttons and the dhoti. And when I told him that I'm sorry I'm late, but this is what happened. He looked at me as though I was a complete cretin and somehow it was all my fault. But despite this, I took the job and I moved to Calcutta.
And what Calcutta must have been in those days with Pink Elephant and all the music scene and the food and everything. I wish we had time to talk about that, but I will move to Delhi because I imagine, and again I might be completely wrong, that the journalism world of Delhi and your transition from a magazine person to a newspaper man
Yeah.
couldn't have been, I mean, outside, when people talk about journalism from the outside, it's all the same for them, magazine, newspapers, etc., but they can be very different universes. I'm going to ask you a largish question because time is short so that you can touch upon many different things in this, because I'm curious about what Delhi was like when you moved there. I'm curious about what the transition to becoming a newspaper man was like, what newsrooms looked like back then compared to what they look like now. Another thing that, again, maybe some of you who are listening in don't know, but Vir, of course, ended up becoming the editor of Hindustan Times. And under his command, the paper grew enormously. And there were many regional editions that were launched. And that's just one of the areas of growth that he sort of oversaw. So I'm also kind of curious to know what the promise of a newspaper was at that point in time, what people believed a newspaper could be, and to what did that promise translate? I know this is many questions in one, but I'm sure you can tackle this.
No, I'll give you a brief rundown. I mean, the truth is that Indian newspapers were pathetic till about the late 80s, early 90s. The first proper newspaper to come out in India was the Telegraph in 82, which was edited and started by M.J. Akbar, who was a magazine person. The other great change came with the Economic Times, which was revamped and redone by T.N. Nayanan, who also came from a magazine environment. He'd come from India Today, where he was business editor. So there was already the Indian Express hired Suman Dubey, who'd been managing editor of India Today. Shekhar Gupta, who later went on to work at the Express, also started at India Today. So essentially, the story of India's newspaper business is of very old, not very good newspapers run by vast bureaucracies with old-fashioned ways being changed by a variety of magazine journalists and editors who joined them and dragged them kicking and screaming into the 20th century. So for me to do that was in many ways the obvious thing to do. I was a little apprehensive about the Hindustan Times because I joined it at a time of great challenge. The first person to see that the world was changing was Sameer Jain. And the Times of India changed to a completely different product. The Economic Times redefined newspaper journalism. And the HT, which had been like, if the circulation of the Times of India was 10, the circulation of the HT was 40. There was that kind of gap between them. And the Times of India then started a price war. And as a consequence, people ordered both newspapers. And the HT's circulation lead more or less disappeared. So the Times, of course, got more advertising. It was seen as the smart Bombay paper. The Hindustan Times was still the only English newspaper in the world to be written entirely in Punjabi. So it was a problem with this was that all its traditional Punjabi readers were dying off and the children were switching to the Times of India. So the challenge being Shobna Bharati, who really handled it, I only helped, was to try and transform the paper to the new era and make it an English language smart paper. I think now if you were asked to choose between the Times and the HT, some people might pick Times, some people may pick HT, but they're broadly the same sort of newspaper. That wasn't true. The difference, I think you would have had to, if you picked HT, if you picked the Times of India and you'd seen the HT then, the HT would have looked really parochial and provincial. But because of magazine journalism, because of lots of magazine journalists, we turned that paper around.
You know, there is this term that is obviously bandied about a lot, which is Lutyens journalists, Lutyens coterie. And of course, nowadays, more often than not, it's used as a pejorative term. It's probably used a little bit unfairly without a proper understanding of what that could or could not mean. But that said, of course, if you are, I came from Bombay to Delhi as well and joined journalism here after doing it in Bombay. And when you stay long enough in Delhi, there is a kind of small world syndrome that you kind of start to buy into, or maybe it really exists. I mean, that's a larger question. But What I would like to ask you is how was, I mean, because you were doing journalism in Delhi for the first time, even though you were a very senior journalist already, you had plenty of experience. What was the navigating the world of the relationship between journalists and politicians really like for you from the first impression to, of course, as you kind of learned along the way?
Yeah. Well, Pragya, I've always said that in political journalism, there are two kinds of people. There are people who are in it because they love politics, and there are people in it because they love journalism. So I belong to the latter category. I'm very happy writing about national policy or international affairs or about Raj Kapoor. I don't have any snobbery about that. But there are a lot of people who I think made it their business to cultivate political sources, would be the first with sort of minor political gossip, like which MLA is going to be made a minister in Uttar Pradesh or whatever. I always reckoned that didn't matter. And I think over time it's mattered less and less. But every political establishment everywhere in the world will have its kept journalists, for want of a better term, and its tame journalists, people who will want to hang around it. It happened, as you say, in the Lachin's world is basically a code word for people who spoke English better than most others. But it happens with language journalism. It happens now. I think with the current establishment, there are more kept journalists than there were even during the Congress era. It's not to do with the Congress or the current establishment. It's the nature of journalism and power. That's why so many journalists end up joining politics. If you're in it because you love politics, then at some stage you're going to be dissatisfied being just a journalist. You'll want to be part of the action. You'll want to be a politician. And then you'll realize the journalists ultimately are much better people, nicer people. It's a much nicer world.
Yeah. But, I just to kind of stay with this question a little bit. You are the editor, and that's a wonderful distinction you made. You are a journalist who loves journalism rather than politics, but you are the editor. You are sitting in Delhi. You're the editor of a very, very prominent newspaper. Again, this is a very large question, and hopefully you write about it in your book. But what is it like navigating that line? I mean, where do you draw the line in terms of being friendly? You run into the same people, and then still keeping your distance. Did that take a while, or did you take to that instinctively?
Well, one of the advantages of being an editor is that you don't really have to go out and get the scoops. So as long as you hire good journalists and they go out and they get the scoops and they develop sources, you're largely insulated from the pressure of having to be nice to politicians or whatever. I was very fortunate during my time when I was at the Hindustan Times that I first had Atal Bihari Vajpayee as Prime Minister. And I got along very well with him. I knew him extremely well. And he was the kind of person who welcomed a dissent. I often wrote very critical things about the BJP. Yet if I went to his house, he was never in the slightest bit hostile or indifferent or whatever. Sonia Gandhi, similarly, you sometimes wondered whether she actually read the articles, because even when you've done something just tearing apart the Congress party, she was the same. The chap who actually took all this stuff badly was Manmohan Singh. Every time I met him, there would always be some diatribe about some article. Why has Cho Ramaswamy written this about me? Why have you carried it on the editorial page? And you sort of explain to him gently that, I'm only the editor. I have to carry different points of view. This is not my point of view. But he never really understood. And by the end, when I'd sort of been critical of him, he just stopped talking to me.
That is a very, very interesting perspective. And that obviously leads me to my next question, which is, we talk about obviously everything, every problem in every era seems like it's novel to it, but censorship and pressures of censorship have existed. And I'm not talking about the formal structure of censorship here. I'm not talking about the laws and the reform we need there, etc., or the criminal justice system, but just the sort of subtle pressures that one encounters being a journalist, particularly being an editor. We know that they've existed forever. When you became a journalist, there was the emergency, and then of course things eased off, but that never really stops. There's always a subtle pressure. I would be very curious to know what, beyond, what the insight you just gave us, how has that changed over the years? And what are the mechanisms of controlling, informal mechanisms of controlling the press that differ from now to then? And maybe in this question, you could also talk a little bit about ownership, because again, publishers really drive it. It's not just the editors who get the flack usually, but it's ownership, the sort of invisible hand that ends up controlling the editor. So how has that changed from then to now?
Well, it's always been a function of how far the politicians are prepared to go and how far the owners are prepared to bend. Journalists themselves rarely come under direct pressure from politicians. The most they can do is deny you access. And most politicians know that even if they say to you, I know your owner or whatever, it doesn't matter because the journalist will leave the job and have a new owner 2 years later, 3 years later, that politician will still be around. So politicians on the whole don't like getting into pangas with journalists. What happens is they get into pangas with the editor, with the owners. And nearly every owner has some skeleton on his or her cupboard. Or if they don't have skeletons, they are in other businesses and they're vulnerable to that kind of pressure. When I joined the Hindustan Times, I was very apprehensive because journalistic gossip had it that B.G. Verghese, who was editor of the Hindustan Times, who had previously been press secretary to Indira Gandhi and then fell out with her, was sacked by the Hindustan Times because Mrs. Gandhi said that he should be sacked. I had also read K.K. Birla's autobiography when he talks about looking for an editor and asks Mrs. Gandhi, who do you suggest? And she says, why don't you talk to Sanjay? And so he talks to Sanjay and Sanjay says, perfect, give Menaka the job. Now, obviously, there's a limit to everybody and he wasn't prepared to go that far. So he went back to Sanjay and said, look, I don't think Menaka's old enough for the job. Who else do you suggest? And he suggested Kushwant Singh, who was duly made editor of the Hindustan Times. So given this background, I was very, very apprehensive when I joined because I wondered what would happen. But I think much to my surprise, I mean, because I'm writing this autobiography, I've been trying to look for instances. There was not one single instance when they asked me to change something or stop me from carrying stories. There were pressures. I remember we once ran a story on an alleged terrorist massacre in Kashmir. What had happened was the police had opened fire and killed lots of civilians who'd been caught in the crossfire. And they were covering this up and saying, enemies of the nation, terrorists, Pakistan at hand. We ran the story on page one. Many people, Arun Jaitley was a friend of mine and a friend of my proprietors, called me up and told me I was anti-national for carrying it. But to the credit of my proprietors, not one word was said. There was a famous shootout in Delhi, which they claimed was a shootout, when the Delhi cops on the eve of Diwali said that two men had come to Ansal Plaza, which was then the biggest mall in Delhi, and had tried to blow it up. But the intrepid Delhi police who were waiting in the parking lot had subdued them and shot them and killed them. Now, there were many, many holes with the story, and it became clear as we talked to eyewitnesses, etc., that these two men were brought by the Delhi police in a car, were taken to the parking lot, and were then executed in what we like to call an encounter. Now, I thought it was a complete scandal, and we ran the story on page one for 4 days in a row. And there were huge complaints from the Delhi police, huge complaints from the establishment, huge complaints from Mr. Advani, who was the Home Minister, and I think he was already Deputy Prime Minister, but he's certainly the Home Minister. And he's the man who said that under his leadership, a terrorist attack had been foiled. But nobody told me not to do the story. So, yes, there are pressures, and there have been pressures in the Sunday Times, I'm sure, before and after, and at every other newspaper. But I'm touch wood. I was very fortunate I didn't have that.
You know, the flip side of this obviously has to be media ethics. We talk about press freedom without talking about press ethics, and that's, at least to my mind, half the conversation. You know, India's never had sort of a formal code of ethics, and you sit on the, or at least you sat, I don't know if you're still on the committee for BCCC, but India's never really had a formal structure for self-regulation, nothing that's really, you know, toothy at least. Where do you see, was there in your time, I mean, you have had seniors and then you've gone to an editor's position. In your time, was there a very clearly understood ethical code that was sacrosanct, or at least should have been sacrosanct? And do you feel like that's been completely dismantled? And if it has, then what do you think might be the reasons for it?
I think we have a very Indian tendency when we talk about ethics, we talk about corruption. So were journalists on the take? Probably. Are they still on the take? Possibly. I don't know. But I don't think that's the real problem. The real problem is the issues of privacy, of fair reporting, of carrying both sides of the story. And I don't think we've ever really had a tradition of that in India, which always upsets me. People will run stories without checking them with anyone. Arun Shori, when he was there to the Indian Express, I asked him, I said, why do you suppose so many journalists get a story and then print it without verification? He said they're scared that if the story turns out to be wrong or if somebody denies it, they'll lose their scoop. So far better to run the story today and run the denial the next day. And unfortunately, that's still the pattern. There wasn't really any regulation worth the while. There was the Press Council, which was essentially an internal body of the newspaper business, along with a few others, and usually a retired justice who wanted to make a name for himself. It never did any good then. It's much better now, but it's still a body that most journalists are not that aware of. The broadcasting industry started these two bodies, one of which, the one you mentioned, the BCCC, which I was on, was the big one because it covered the entire industry, with the exception of news. News had, I think, it was called the NBSA, which was a separate body, and it was, as you can see, completely ineffectual because it was still looking at things like, is any dishonesty happening? Is something like that happening? And in the process, the news sector, the television news sector, has gone completely off the rails. There's now not even a pretense at partiality. It's much more biased than it ever was. It takes advantage of the fact that even if people sue, it takes years for the case to come to trial. And in the era of social media, I mean, there's a study which shows that a lie on Twitter is 30 times more effective than the truth. So, unfortunately, and I say this as somebody who's run both media, television and print, I had imagined that print would continue following the ethics, flawed as they may be TV would continue following the ethics, flawed as they may be of print, but it hasn't. Television today doesn't take its cues from any journalistic tradition. It takes its cues from Facebook, WhatsApp, and Twitter. Essentially, what you have in many studios is trolls masquerading as anchors and WhatsApp forwards, which are treated as scripts.
That is brilliantly put, but I will abruptly switch to a completely different area because I've just been told that I have 5 minutes. It'll be criminal not to talk to you about food. I live for your food writing, but and again, I have a million questions, but I will condense them into one little thing. You mentioned when we started talking, there were maybe 2 restaurants of note when you started journalism in Bombay in the 70s. Today, of course, there's a plethora of restaurants everywhere. Is that necessarily a good thing? The proliferation of restaurants, is that working out? Is that playing out how you would want it to play out, or how you had imagined it would play out? What are the trends that you encourage? What are the trends in the eating out industry that you feel need to change? And are there bars and restaurants, few and far between as they were in the 70s and 80s maybe, that do not exist any longer and you miss them?
I'm trying to answer all of them.
Sorry.
I miss the old rendezvous at the Taj in Bombay, which was wonderful. I miss the Casa Medici at the Taj in Delhi. Most of the standalones have survived. I think Gaylord's in quality. I think the Gaylord's in Delhi has not survived, which is a bit of a shame. But to answer your larger question, research has shown us all over that whenever a middle class has more money, the first things it spends that money on are travel and food. So with the liberalization of 1991, and which took 6-7 years to put more money in our pockets, it was inevitable that there would be a restaurant boom. But in our case, it was doubled because this boom in restaurants was also assisted by a globalization of our media. We'd come from a Doordarshan and a Zee TV perhaps only scenario to getting 40 channels, many of which had food shows on them. And by the end of the 1990s, you had the internet, and people were watching things like Top Chef on the internet, on various websites. So all of this happened together, and it led inevitably to some kind of eating out boom. Now, is the boom a good thing? Are all the restaurants good? No, of course they aren't. But are there enough good restaurants? Has there been enough happening in the world of food to make me happy? Yes, there is.
Okay. I will ask another question before I start taking questions from the audiences. Just to carry on with the food theme, one of the things that at least I find, still not adequately represented in the restaurant scene in our metros, is that we don't get enough of regional cuisine. I mean, there is, now things are changing, but if you really wanted to have very good Andhra cuisine, maybe there are 2 or 3 places you can go to. If you wanted to have very good Odia cuisine, you probably can't think of any restaurant that you can really go to. So I'm just wondering, what do you think is, this sort of standardization of what people eat and what kinds of things restaurants offer, is that a compulsion of the market, or is that just lack of imagination?
No, I think it's to do with history. I take your point, but when it comes to regional food, it's much better now than it was earlier. We have no Indian restaurant tradition. Most of our restaurants were started by people who came over after partition, and they served the quality kind of meal, which became standard all over India. I think in this century, that's opened up. There are more South Indian restaurants. There are Bengali restaurants in Delhi and in Bombay, which is something we wouldn't have thought possible even 5 years ago.
Well, yeah, and I may their tribe increase. With that, I will start taking questions from the audience, because there are more than a couple of them. All right, so Supriya Sharma asks, with reference to your career, if there was an era that you would like to recreate, which era would that be?
I think the period when we turned the HT era. I was editor from 1999 to 2003, editorial director from 2003 to 2007, and those were probably the most fun years of my career.
I'll add a supplementary question to that. Is there anything you do differently if you could recreate that era, if you go back to that era?
Till 2007? Well, I left the HT to start a news channel with people who were not really serious about the news channel. So the news channel didn't start. They left the channel and then are now famous in different contexts, which I will not talk about. But I think I wish I hadn't left, and I wish I hadn't tried to start that news channel, because that was a disaster.
Question. How do you view, this is from Kripa Mathur, how do you view the shift in print media and its revamped role in the new digital era? Do you believe newspapers and magazines will actually disappear?
Well, actually, sorry, I missed the last bit. Okay, I'm having a problem with reception, but generally, I think what will happen is that print media is dying. It will survive. It will survive in a sort of limited form. But that doesn't mean that the values and the traditions of print media will not survive. What will happen is that people will begin to consume news more in a cocktail menu kind of way than in a set meal kind of way. At the moment, when you get a newspaper, you try and read all of it. What will happen is that people go onto social media, individual stories, individual columnists, and will click on them and will pick and choose what they want. The editor will no longer dictate their preferences.
Kamya asks, I miss going to my favorite restaurants, but the fact that eating out can make me get COVID is very scary. How do you think we can feel safe and not let anxiety come in between our relationship with food? I will ask you to start by answering this. Have you started going back to restaurants, and what's your experience been like?
If I'm convinced that a restaurant has sanitization methods in place and it practices social distancing, the people who serve me wear masks or shields, I will go back. One of the great myths of this whole COVID epidemic, and it's an Indian myth, is that you can get COVID from food. You can't. You get COVID from people. So as long as you avoid contact with people, you're all right. I mean, the same people who used to say, hey, I will never eat out because it's very dangerous, I will never order in, why are you recommending delivery places, have now come around to the view that food is not so dangerous. Going to the restaurants is the next hurdle. It'll be difficult, but I think we'll cross it in a month or so.
And it just as an addition to that, what about travel? Have you started traveling at all? And what has that experience been like? Is it different? Is it more, does it make one more anxious? What is
I haven't been on an aeroplane since I think the middle of March. I'm just hesitant about doing that. So I've done travel, I've done holidays, but I've always done holidays in distances that are manageable, places you can drive to. I've been to Jaipur, I've been to Manesar, and I may be going to Alvar, but it's always nearby.
Bhanu Sharma asks, what is the one food item you hold close to your heart from childhood? And actually, I would also be curious to know when did you realize you love food as much as you do, and when was the moment when you realized that you wanted to spend a lot of time writing about it, or even thinking about it?
It never really happened, Pragya. I became a food journalist purely by accident. We were revamping the Sunday magazine of the Hindustan Times, the one that was before Branch. I said food is going to be really big in this century. We should have a food columnist. They couldn't find one. I wrote a piece for the dummy. And then when we were ready to launch, we still couldn't find a food columnist. So they carried that in the original article. And because it was felt at the time by the powers that be that the editor of the Hindustan Times shouldn't write a political article and a food article on the same day, I signed it for I think 3 years or so under a pseudonym. So I just got sucked into it. There was never a eureka moment when I said, I love this, this is what I'm going to do.
What about food of childhood, which is what Bhanu Sharma wants to know about? Was it Gujarati cuisine? What is it that you remember from your childhood?
Not a lot is the honest answer. Whenever people ask me, do you have a favorite book, a favorite movie, a favorite dish, a favorite city? I really don't have that many favorites. I remember eating quite well during my childhood because we traveled a fair amount in all over the world and we ate a lot. But nothing really clings to the memory. I mean, I have a memory of food attached to things that mattered. For instance, my father, who was not very keen on Western food, or though he had to travel and eat it, used to have a favorite restaurant in Geneva called the Café de Paris, which did a steak with chips. So I remember that. But I don't think it's the steak and chips I remember, but I just remember the joy of going with him.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. And Navya asks, do you think that the pandemic might affect the future of the food industry?
Oh, it already has, and it will certainly affect the future in the sense that I don't think the food industry will ever be the same again. Many restaurants will not reopen. In the UK, they reckon that 40% of restaurants won't reopen. I don't know what the figure in India is. I hope it's not 40%. But it won't be necessarily the famous or big restaurants. It'll be the smaller places that work on very thin margins that won't be able to survive with social distancing. I also think delivery is now here to stay. People are much more comfortable with ordering food in. That's another problem for restaurants because delivery from restaurants is at restaurant prices, but delivery from a cloud kitchen, which is increasingly what's happening, is the food is made at 1/10 the cost and sold at half the price. So restaurants will lose out to cloud kitchens. And also, I mean, everyone is, not all of us are going to the American bar at the Savoy or whatever. Many of us are staying at home and making things ourselves. And as a consequence, I think people have discovered cooking and the joy of cooking and will stay at home.
But the UK has given a big sort of subsidy as well to the restaurant business. Do you think something like that could really help the restaurant industry in India, or do you think that our economics are vastly different from that of the UK?
No, it would help. I think in the restaurant industry and the National Restaurant Association, all of which have been great cheerleaders for this regime and this government, and the Prime Minister personally expected that things would happen. Nothing happened. I did a Zoom type interview at a conference with Amitabh Kant, and I said, why have you done nothing for this sector? And he said, we've done nothing for any sector. We are taking an economy-wide approach, not a sector-specific approach. So I guess restaurants will just die.
Okay, I think I have time for one more question. I hope I do, but I'm not being given a cue to shut up, so I'm just going to go ahead and take that. Arunaya asks, how do you view this decade of the WhatsApp university? As you mentioned, there's very little fact-checking that is going on these days. What is the way forward?
I don't know. I wish I had an answer. I've just written a piece about it in Business Standard 2 days ago. I used to think that if India had more education, as people learned more about things, they would be more interested in facts and less interested in innuendo. In fact, the opposite has happened. As you say, anyone with a telephone or a smartphone is now a graduate of WhatsApp University. And the algorithms of all the social media networks create an echo chamber in which you're just being told what you already know or what you want to hear. Conspiracy theories are on the rise. And the media, which have a role, I think, to set this right have shirked that role, and television particularly has served as the biggest multiplier for WhatsApp University.
Well, I've just been told time is up, and as incredible as it was to speak to you, I feel it's a real bummer because I was just about getting started asking you questions, and I could go on listening to you forever. So, if you feel the same way, fortunately, Vir has written a lot of columns, of books, so you can definitely buy those. And I, for one, will be waiting for the memoir with bated breath. Thank you so much, Vir.
Thank you so much.
Real,
That
real
was so much fun.
pleasure.
You covered so much ground. I really enjoyed that.
Thank you so much, Vir Sanghvi. Thank you, Pragya Tiwari. As we said, television has much to answer for. The editor may not anymore dictate what you read. You'll really click on what you wish to click or read. You will read those columns of journalists who you're interested in. And of course, restaurants may lose out to cloud kitchens. On that note, thank you, Vir Sanghvi. Thank you, Pragya Tiwari. Thank you all for watching. We're sorry we couldn't take all the questions. I mean, Pragya was making a valiant effort to get them all out to you. And we really did a great job in trying to answer them succinctly, but we still couldn't get all the questions. Many apologies for that. We do hope you'll be able to log back on at 8:30 p.m. for our next session of JLF's Brave New World. Three women, Lisa Tadeo in conversation with Ira Trivedi. Lisa Tadeo's latest book, Three Women, is a worldwide sensation which explores the intricate depths of the female heart in all its passion, heartbreak, and intimacy. In conversation with author Ira Trivedi, two-time Pushcart Prize-winning author and journalist discusses the grim truths about desire and power and how we perceive women. Remember, for those of you who are enthused about catching the last bits of India by the Bay, our festival, which is on in Hong Kong, you can catch this on our YouTube or Facebook pages, or that of Asia Society Hong Kong or Team Arts. We still have 2 episodes to go tomorrow and day after. We've finished. We've completed Wellness and Yoga with Daniel Simpson, Zaika with Chef Romy Gill and Chef Piku. And now we move on to East West, a legacy with Shubhendra Rao and Saskia Rao Dahas with Tijo Manchuing. And of course, literature, Churchill, hero, anti-hero with Shashi Tharoor in conversation with Dr. Mukulika Banerjee. And remember, Sunday, 18th of October, we're back again with I Believe Art Matters, a gala fundraiser to help artists and artisans, bringing together over 450 artists from across music, theater, dance, literature, film, design, fashion, anchored by Shabana Azmi and Manoj Bajpai, and starring everybody, including A.R. Rahman, Salim Suleiman, Shekhar Ravjiani, with the Shillong Chamber Choir, Kailash Kher, and so many others. So do watch this on our Facebook page. It's an association with Give India. Open your wallets. Please, please help the artists and artisans who, as we just said, is one other sector which has not necessarily been supported by government and really need your help. See you at 8:30 p.m.